Before there were laboratories, there was a mountain. Before there were questionnaires, brain scans, or double-blind studies, there was a narrow stone path winding up the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in the Greek region of Phocis, toward a temple wrapped in mist. Pilgrims climbed for days to reach it. Kings sent envoys. Generals delayed their wars to hear what the priestess inside had to say. This was Delphi, the place the ancient Greeks believed to be the center of the world, the omphalos, the navel of the earth. Picture it, the air is thin and cool. Below, the Gulf of Corinth catches the early light like hammered silver. Olive trees move slightly in a wind that smells of stone and pine resin. And ahead, cut into the hillside, stands the Temple of Apollo, its columns pale gold in the morning sun. Its interior dark, secretive, humming faintly with an energy no pilgrim could quite name. Inside, seated on a tripod above a fissure in the rock, sat the Pythia, the oracle. Vapors were said to rise from the earth beneath her. Whether those vapors were mystical, geological, or simply myth, we will likely never know with certainty. Historians still debate their origin. But we know what the pilgrims believed. They believed that in that chamber, ordinary human confusion could, for a moment, touch something larger than itself. And above the entrance to that temple, carved permanently into the stone where every visitor would see it before asking their question of the gods, were two words. Not thy suiton, know thyself, not know the future, not know your fortune or know your fate. The most sacred instruction the ancient Greek world could offer to anyone approaching the divine was not a command to look outward, toward the heavens, or forward toward destiny. It was a command to look inward toward the self. This is where our story begins. Not with Sigmund Freud in Vienna, not with a laboratory in Leipzig, not with rats in a maze or electrodes in a shock generator. It begins nearly 6 centuries before the birth of Christ, with a civilization that had already understood something we are, even now, still struggling to fully grasp. That the least explored territory a human being will ever encounter is not a distant land or an uncharted sea. It is the 3 pounds of tissue behind their own eyes. For the next 3 hours, we are going to walk through that territory together. We will visit the birthplace of psychological science in 19th century Germany. We will sit in on some of the most controversial experiments ever conducted on human behavior. Experiments so unsettling that some of them could never be repeated today. We will meet the philosophers, the physicians, the heretics, and the mathematicians who each, in their own way, tried to answer the question etched into that Delphic stone. We will learn why the mind lies to itself, why fear feels the way it feels, why love and loneliness are 2 sides of the same ancient coin, and why, in the end, the wisest people who ever lived, from Marcus Aurelius to the psychologists of our own era, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about how to live well. This is not a story about diagnosing disorders or hacking your brain into productivity. It is something older and, I would argue, something more valuable. It is the story of the self, how it forms, how it deceives, how it suffers, and how, with enough honesty, it can also heal. Let us begin as the Greeks did at the temple. Long before anyone used the word psychology, human beings were already theorizing about the mind. They simply didn't yet have the tools or the humility to test their theories. In ancient Egypt, physicians who treated head wounds noticed something remarkable, and it survives in a document known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text believed to date back to around 1600 BCE, though likely copied from a much older source. The papyrus describes cases of skull trauma, and in doing so, contains what may be the earliest known reference to the brain as an organ connected to bodily function. A description of how injury to one side of the skull could affect movement on the opposite side of the body. The Egyptians had glimpsed, however faintly, that the brain was not merely decorative. It did something. It mattered. And yet, for most of the ancient world, the heart, not the brain, was considered the seat of thought, emotion, and moral judgment. When Egyptian priests prepared a body for the afterlife, they carefully preserved the heart, believing it would be weighed against a feather in the hall of judgment. The brain, by contrast, was often removed through the nose with a hooked instrument and simply discarded. It was considered, quite literally, useless packing material. This tells us something important before we go any further. For the vast majority of human history, people were confident about the mind while being almost entirely wrong about its biology. And this pattern, confidence outpacing accuracy, will return again and again throughout this documentary, because it is, in many ways, the central psychological trap of being human. We are a species remarkably good at forming strong opinions and remarkably slow at revising them. The Greeks moved the conversation forward, though even they disagreed among themselves. Alcmaeon of Croton, a physician working around the 5th century BCE, dissected animals and concluded that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of understanding. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, agreed, writing that it was from the brain, and the brain alone, that our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests arose, as well as our sorrows, pains, griefs, and tears. But it was Plato and Aristotle, teacher and student, who gave the ancient world its first true psychological philosophy. And tellingly, they disagreed with each other in ways that still echo through modern debates. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, imagined the soul as divided into 3 parts: reason, seated in the head; spirit, seated in the chest, responsible for courage and honor; and appetite, seated in the belly, responsible for hunger and desire. In his famous image from the Phaedrus, Plato described the soul as a charioteer trying to control 2 winged horses, one noble and obedient, representing our higher impulses, and one wild and stubborn, representing our base desires. The charioteer's entire task, and by extension, every human being's entire task, was to keep those 2 horses moving in the same direction. If that sounds familiar, it should. Nearly 24 centuries later, psychologists would describe something remarkably similar: a mind divided between impulsive, emotional processes and slower, more deliberate reasoning. We will meet that idea again in a very different form in Chapter 8. Aristotle, ever the empiricist, took a more grounded approach than his teacher. He rejected the idea of a soul that existed independently of the body, and instead argued that the soul was the form of a living thing, inseparable from it, the way the shape of a fist is inseparable from the hand that makes it. In his treatise De Anima, On the Soul, Aristotle laid out what many historians consider the first systematic work of psychology in the Western tradition. He classified different faculties of the soul: nutrition, perception, movement, and reason. He wrote about memory, dreams, and the senses with the careful, observational eye of a natural scientist rather than a mystic. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, entirely separate traditions were arriving at their own sophisticated understandings of the mind. In ancient India, Buddhist philosophy, developing from roughly the 6th century BCE onward, produced extraordinarily detailed maps of consciousness, attention, and suffering. The Abhidharma texts catalog mental states with a precision that would not be matched in the West for over 2,000 years. The Buddha's core insight, that human suffering arises largely from attachment and from the mind's compulsive habit of grasping at permanence in an impermanent world, is, in essence, a psychological theory, one that modern clinical psychology has only recently begun to formally borrow from, in the form of mindfulness-based therapies. In China, Confucian and Taoist thinkers were exploring the cultivation of character, the nature of virtue, and the tension between social duty and inner authenticity, questions that occupy entire subfields of modern personality and social psychology today. What strikes me most, looking back across these traditions, is not how primitive they were, but how much they got right using nothing but careful observation and patient reasoning. They lacked brain scanners. They lacked controlled experiments. They lacked statistics. What they had was something we sometimes undervalue today. They sat still, and they paid attention to themselves, to each other, to the patterns of human behavior repeating across 1,000 ordinary days. And in that attention, they found real insight. But observation alone has limits. Without a method for testing an idea, for separating what is true from what merely sounds wise, even brilliant insight can calcify into dogma. For nearly 2,000 years after Aristotle, the study of the mind remained largely the province of philosophers and theologians, debated in monasteries and universities, but rarely tested against evidence in any systematic way. That was about to change, and it would change not in Athens or Alexandria, but in a quiet German university city, in a modest room fitted with brass instruments, timers, and an unusual piece of furniture that its inventor referred to only half-jokingly as the thinking chair. The year is 1879. The city is Leipzig in the Kingdom of Saxony, a place better known at the time for its publishing houses and its famous trade fairs than for scientific revolution. But in a modest set of rooms at the University of Leipzig, a 50-year-old physiologist named Wilhelm Wundt is doing something no one has ever done before in quite this way. He is trying to measure the mind. Wundt had trained as a physician and worked for a time as an assistant to Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the great scientific minds of the 19th century, a man who had already measured the speed of nerve impulses. A discovery that stunned the scientific world because it implied that even thought itself was not instantaneous, but took time and could therefore, in principle, be studied like any other physical process. One absorbed this lesson completely. If thought took time, then thought could be timed. And if it could be timed, it could be experimented upon. In that small laboratory, widely credited by historians as the first laboratory in the world dedicated purely to psychological research, Wundt and his students devised deceptively simple experiments. A participant would sit in a chair. A bell would ring or a light would flash. The participant would press a button as soon as they perceived it. Using precise chronometers, Wundt's team could measure, down to fractions of a second, how long it took a human being to register a sensation and respond to it. It sounds almost too simple to matter. But consider what Wundt was actually proposing, which was radical for its time. That the inner life of a person, perception, attention, will, was not some untouchable spiritual mystery beyond the reach of science, as it had been treated for millennia. It was a natural phenomenon, governed by natural laws, and it could be studied with the same rigor that a chemist studied a compound or a physicist studied a falling object. Wundt called his method introspection, though it was a far more disciplined version of the word than we use casually today. He trained his research subjects, often his own graduate students, for months before they were considered reliable enough to participate in an experiment, teaching them to report their immediate sensory experience without interpretation or embellishment. Not "I saw a red apple and thought of my grandmother's orchard," but simply, a patch of red, a certain brightness, a particular duration. Wundt's laboratory became something of a pilgrimage site in its own right, not unlike Delphi, though its visitors arrived by train rather than on foot and carried notebooks rather than offerings. Students came from across Europe and from the United States to learn his methods and bring them home. Within a few decades, psychology laboratories modeled on Wundt's had opened across the Western world, at Harvard, at Cornell, at the University of Pennsylvania, at universities across Britain, France, and Russia. A new science had been born, and it had a name that Wundt himself had helped popularize. Psychology, from the Greek psyche, meaning soul or breath, and logos, meaning study or reason. Quite literally, the study of the soul, except now approached not through prayer or philosophy, but through timers, charts, and careful measurement. It is worth pausing here to notice something almost poetic. The ancient Greeks had asked us to know ourselves. 2,300 years later, a German physiologist finally built a room in which that self-knowledge could, for the first time, be tested rather than merely asserted. But Wundt's approach, for all its historical importance, had a significant limitation, one that would soon spark rebellion among his own intellectual descendants. Introspection, no matter how disciplined, still relied entirely on a person's own report of their inner experience. And inner experience, it would turn out, is a remarkably unreliable narrator. A person cannot introspect on a process they are not consciously aware of. And as an ambitious young Viennese neurologist was about to argue, with tremendous consequences for the entire 20th century, the vast majority of what drives human behavior may not be conscious at all. His name was Sigmund Freud, and the picture of the human mind he was about to paint would prove to be one of the most influential and most controversial in the entire history of ideas. Vienna in the final years of the 19th century was a city of extraordinary contradictions. On its surface, it was the glittering capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a city of waltzes, coffee houses, opera houses, and imperial grandeur. Beneath that surface, in its hospitals and consulting rooms, a quieter revolution was taking shape, one concerned not with empire, but with the empire each person carries within themselves, largely unseen and largely unruled. In a modest apartment at Burgas 19, a neurologist in his 40s sat each day with patients suffering from symptoms medicine of the time could not explain. Paralysis with no physical cause, blindness with healthy eyes, tremors that came and went with no injury behind them. His name was Sigmund Freud, and the patients who came to him were, in the language of the era, diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all term applied almost exclusively to women, for suffering that doctors could not locate in the body and therefore dismissed, all too often, as imagination or weakness of character. Freud refused to dismiss it. He listened. And in listening, really listening, for long, uninterrupted stretches, allowing patients to speak whatever came to mind without censorship or direction, a method he would come to call free association, he began to notice patterns. Symptoms that seemed physically inexplicable often traced back, through a patient's own words, to memories, conflicts, and desires the patient had never consciously connected to their suffering. A forgotten trauma, a forbidden wish, a grief never permitted expression. From these observations, Freud built what remains one of the most influential and most contested theories in the history of psychology. The idea that the human mind is not a single, unified, transparent thing, fully known to itself, but something closer to an iceberg, in which the small, visible portion above the waterline, our conscious awareness, represents only a fraction of what is actually there. Beneath the surface lies the unconscious, vast, largely inaccessible. And yet, in Freud's view, the true engine driving an enormous share of human thought, feeling, and behavior. It is difficult from where we stand today, over a century later, to fully appreciate how radical this idea was at the time. The 19th century mind, shaped by Enlightenment confidence in reason, tended to imagine the self as essentially rational, a captain steering its own ship, fully aware of its own motives and desires. Freud suggested something far more unsettling, that the conscious self is less like a captain and more like a passenger, often unaware of the currents actually determining the ship's course. Freud proposed that the mind could be understood as composed of three interacting forces. The id, present from birth, operating entirely in the unconscious, driven by instinct and desire, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain without regard for consequence or propriety. The part of us, Freud suggested, closest to a hungry infant, wanting what it wants immediately without apology. The superego, formed gradually through upbringing and culture, representing internalized rules, ideals, and the voice of conscience. The part of us that feels guilt, that judges, that holds up a standard we may or may not be able to meet. And between these two forces, mediating, negotiating, compromising, sits the ego, the part of the self most closely aligned with what we consciously experience as me, attempting the impossible diplomatic task of satisfying primal desire, honoring internalized morality, and navigating the actual constraints of external reality all at once. Much of Freud's specific theoretical architecture, the precise mechanics of the id, ego, and superego, his particular emphasis on childhood sexuality as the primary engine of development, his interpretation of dreams as coded wish fulfillment, has not survived rigorous scientific scrutiny in the century since he proposed it. Modern psychology has moved considerably beyond classical Freudian theory, and it is important, in the spirit of intellectual honesty, to say so plainly rather than to romanticize a legacy simply because it is famous. Many of Freud's specific claims were never tested with the kind of controlled methodology that later psychologists and later chapters of this documentary will show became the field's gold standard. And yet, to dismiss Freud entirely would be its own kind of intellectual error. Because underneath the specific architecture, Freud left behind a handful of insights that have proven remarkably durable, echoed and independently confirmed by nearly every branch of psychology that followed him. That much of our behavior is driven by processes we are not consciously aware of. That early experience shapes adult patterns in ways we do not fully recognize while they are happening to us. That the mind actively works, sometimes quite elaborately, to protect itself from information, memories, impulses, truths about ourselves, that it finds too threatening to face directly. Freud called these protective maneuvers defense mechanisms. Denial, repression, projection, rationalization. The mind's quiet, largely automatic strategies for keeping uncomfortable truths beneath the waterline. Consider, for a moment, how often you have watched someone, perhaps even yourself, grow suddenly and disproportionately angry at a minor inconvenience, only to realize later that the anger had almost nothing to do with the inconvenience itself, and everything to do with something else entirely. An old wound, an unspoken fear, an exhaustion that had nowhere else to go. That experience, so common it barely needs explaining, is Freud's central insight in miniature. We are not always the authors of our own reactions. Something older and less visible is often writing the first draft. Freud died in London in 1939, having fled Vienna the year before, as the Nazi annexation of Austria made the city no longer safe for a Jewish intellectual of his prominence. He left behind a body of work that reshaped not just psychology, but literature, art, film, and the very language ordinary people use to describe their inner lives. We speak casually today of a Freudian slip, of being in denial, of repressing a memory, evidence of just how thoroughly his framework, however scientifically imperfect, seeped into the common vocabulary of Western thought. But Freud's ideas did not go unchallenged, even by those closest to him. One of his most brilliant early followers, a man Freud once considered his intellectual heir, his crown prince, would eventually break from him entirely, over a disagreement that cut to the very heart of what drives the human psyche. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and the mind he described would prove, in its own way, just as strange and just as enduring as Freud's. In the small Swiss village of Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich, stands a stone tower that Carl Jung built, largely with his own hands over the course of several decades. He called it his confession in stone, a physical structure that grew, room by room, as his own understanding of the psyche grew, each new addition representing some new layer of insight he had reached in his own inner exploration. It is a striking image, a psychologist literally building a home that mirrored the architecture of his theories, stone by stone, as if the mind itself could be given a physical address. Jung had trained as a psychiatrist in Zurich, and by his early 30s had already achieved considerable renown, in part through his groundbreaking work using word association tests to uncover what he called complexes, clusters of emotionally charged, partly unconscious ideas that could disrupt a person's normal thought patterns when triggered. It was this work, along with his evident brilliance, that drew Freud's attention. The two men began an intense correspondence and friendship, with Freud, at one point, telling Jung explicitly that he saw him as the natural successor to lead the psychoanalytic movement, a movement still fighting at the time for basic scientific legitimacy in a medical establishment that regarded it with deep suspicion. But the friendship and the professional alliance did not survive their theoretical differences. Freud believed, with increasing rigidity as the years passed, that human motivation traced back overwhelmingly to sexual drive and its repression. Jung came to believe this was too narrow, too reductive, a description that failed to account for the full range of human meaning-making. Our art, our religions, our myths, our dreams, which seemed to Jung to point towards something larger than sexual instinct alone. The two men broke, painfully and permanently, around 1913, and Jung entered what he would later describe as a period of profound personal crisis, what some biographers have called his own creative illness, a period of intense inner turmoil during which he began recording his dreams, visions, and fantasies with obsessive care, material that would eventually form the basis of nearly everything he wrote for the rest of his life. From this period emerged Jung's central and most enduring idea, that beneath the personal unconscious Freud had described, the repository of each individual's own forgotten memories and repressed desires, lies something deeper still, which Jung called the collective unconscious. This, Jung argued, was not personal at all, but inherited, shared across all of humanity, a kind of psychological substrate laid down by the accumulated experience of countless generations of human ancestors facing the same recurring situations. Birth, death, the search for a mate, the confrontation with danger, the relationship between parent and child. Within this collective unconscious, Jung proposed live universal patterns he called archetypes, recurring figures and themes that appear in strikingly similar form across the myths, religions, folktales, and dreams of cultures that had no historical contact with one another. The hero who must leave the safety of home and face trial in order to return transformed. The wise old man or woman who offers guidance at a critical threshold. The great mother, embodying both nurture and devouring danger. And perhaps most famously, the shadow, the disowned, rejected parts of ourselves, the qualities we find too uncomfortable to acknowledge as our own, which we then unconsciously project outward onto others, seeing in them the very faults we cannot bear to see in ourselves. Think for a moment about how often intense dislike of another person carries a strange, disproportionate emotional charge, a reaction that feels bigger than the situation warrants. Jung would suggest that such moments are often our own shadow, glimpsed reflected in someone else, provoking a reaction not because the other person's flaw is uniquely terrible, but because it is uncomfortably familiar. Everyone carries a shadow, Jung wrote, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The goal of psychological maturity in Jung's framework was never to eliminate the shadow, an impossible task, but to integrate it, to know it, to bring it into conscious relationship with the rest of the self, a lifelong process Jung called individuation. The gradual, often difficult work of becoming a whole and undivided person, rather than a fragmented collection of accepted and rejected parts. It is worth noting, with the same honesty we applied to Freud, that Jung's theory of the collective unconscious and archetypes remains scientifically contested. It is difficult to test empirically, and many contemporary psychologists regard it as more a work of philosophy, mythology, and depth psychology than a strictly falsifiable scientific model. But like Freud, Jung's influence extends far beyond the narrow question of whether every specific claim can be experimentally verified. His ideas shaped comparative mythology, literary criticism, and the modern understanding of storytelling itself. The American mythologist Joseph Campbell's enormously influential concept of the hero's journey, which quietly structures the plot of nearly every major Hollywood film made in the last 50 years, draws directly on Jungian archetypal theory. What Freud and Jung shared, despite their bitter and permanent split, was a conviction that would come to define an entire era of psychology, that the truest engine of human behavior lies hidden beneath conscious awareness, in a territory that resists easy observation and even easier measurement. For the scientists who came next, this was precisely the problem. If psychology wished to be taken seriously as a science, to stand alongside physics, chemistry, and biology, it would need to study something it could actually observe, measure, and predict with precision. It would need, in other words, to stop asking what people were thinking and start watching with total rigor what people actually did. In the early years of the 20th century, in a laboratory in St. Petersburg, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov was not, in fact, trying to study the mind at all. He was studying digestion, specifically the salivary reflexes of dogs, work so significant in its own right that it would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904. Awarded before his most famous discovery had even been fully appreciated for what it was. Pavlov's dogs were fitted with a small surgical tube that allowed researchers to measure their saliva production precisely as they were fed. And in the course of this otherwise unremarkable physiological research, Pavlov's team noticed something odd. The dogs had begun salivating not only when food actually touched their tongues, but earlier, when they merely saw the lab assistant who usually brought the food, or heard his approaching footsteps in the hallway. The dogs, it seemed, had learned to associate a previously neutral stimulus with the arrival of food, and their bodies were now responding to the association itself, in advance of the food's actual arrival. Pavlov, ever the rigorous experimentalist, decided to formalize the observation. He began ringing a bell, or in some accounts a metronome or buzzer, in the moments just before presenting food to the dogs. After repeating this pairing enough times, the dogs began salivating at the sound of the bell alone, even when no food followed. Pavlov called this phenomenon classical conditioning, and in doing so, he had discovered something with implications that would reach far beyond canine digestion. He had discovered that behavior itself, not just physical reflexes, but potentially thought, emotion, and habit, could be systematically shaped through learned association, in ways an organism was not even consciously choosing. This discovery landed in the West at precisely the moment American psychology was searching for a way to become more scientifically respectable, and it found its most forceful champion in a psychologist named John B. Watson, who in 1913 published a manifesto that would come to be known as the Behaviorist Declaration. Watson argued with considerable polemical force that psychology should abandon the study of consciousness, introspection, and the unconscious altogether, all of it in his view too subjective, too unmeasurable, too unscientific, and instead restrict itself entirely to the observation of behavior. Stimulus and response, cause and measurable effect. Give me a dozen healthy infants, Watson famously wrote, in a statement he likely intended more as provocation than literal claim, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. It was a radical claim about the sheer power of environment and conditioning over innate disposition, and while few psychologists today would endorse it in its extreme form, Watson's broader behaviorist framework dominated American psychology for the better part of half a century. Its most influential and sophisticated proponent, however, was not Watson, but a Harvard psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who took the behaviorist project further than anyone before him. Skinner's key contribution was the concept of operant conditioning, The idea that behavior is shaped not merely by prior association, as Pavlov had shown, but by its consequences. Behavior that is followed by a reward, Skinner demonstrated in thousands of meticulous experiments using an apparatus that came to be known as the Skinner box, becomes more likely to be repeated. Behavior followed by punishment, or simply by no reward at all, becomes less likely. Using pigeons and rats as his primary subjects, Skinner showed that he could shape astonishingly complex sequences of behavior through the careful, incremental application of what he called reinforcement, rewarding successive approximations of a desired action until the full behavior emerged. Perhaps Skinner's most striking, and for our purposes today, most practically relevant discovery concerned not simply whether a behavior was rewarded, but the pattern by which it was rewarded. Skinner found that behavior reinforced on a variable, unpredictable schedule. Sometimes rewarded, sometimes not, with no discernible pattern the animal could learn to anticipate, was far more resistant to extinction, far harder to stop, than behavior reinforced predictably every single time. A pigeon rewarded on a variable schedule would continue pecking a lever long after the rewards had stopped altogether, far longer than a pigeon that had always been rewarded consistently. If that finding sounds unsettling in a modern context, it should. It is, quite precisely, the psychological mechanism underlying a slot machine, and by extension, much of the architecture of modern digital technology. The unpredictable rhythm of a notification, a social media like a new match on a dating app, a fresh video in an infinite scroll, all leveraging, whether by careful design or emergent trial and error, the exact same variable reinforcement schedule that kept Skinner's pigeons pecking at their lever long after the payoff had become unreliable. Understanding this single principle, that unpredictable reward is more compelling to the human nervous system than reliable reward, offers real, practical insight into why certain habits, certain relationships, and certain digital products can feel so difficult to walk away from, even when we know on a conscious level that they are not serving us well. Behaviorism, like Freud's psychoanalysis before it, eventually met the limits of its own framework. By restricting itself so strictly to observable behavior, it struggled to account for the internal, cognitive processes, memory, planning, imagination, language, that clearly shaped behavior but could not be directly observed from the outside. In the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of researchers, dissatisfied with behaviorism's refusal to look inside the black box of the mind, began what would come to be called the cognitive revolution, a shift we will explore in detail in part 3 of this documentary. But before we turn to the cognitive mind, we need to address a question that both Freud's depth psychology and Skinner's behaviorism, for all their differences, tended to neglect. Not simply how the mind is shaped by trauma, conditioning, and reward, but what the mind is actually reaching for. What does a human being fundamentally want? An American psychologist working at Brooklyn College in the 1940s believed his predecessors had been asking the wrong question entirely. Instead of studying only the mentally ill, the traumatized, and the conditioned, he proposed studying the healthiest, most fully realized human beings he could find. And in doing so, he produced one of the most recognizable images in the entire history of psychology. One now so ubiquitous it appears in corporate presentations and self-help books, with little acknowledgement of the far more careful thinking behind it. His name was Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow grew up in Brooklyn in the early 20th century, the eldest of 7 children born to Jewish immigrants from Kiev. By his own later account, his childhood was lonely and difficult. He described himself as a shy, awkward boy, isolated both by anti-Semitic hostility in his largely non-Jewish neighborhood and by a strained, at times painful, relationship with his mother, whom he would later describe with striking bitterness. It is one of the quieter ironies of psychology's history that a man who would spend his career studying human flourishing, joy, and self-actualization began his own life in circumstances that offered him relatively little of any of those things. Maslow trained initially within the behaviorist tradition, studying under researchers who shared Watson and Skinner's commitment to observable behavior. But over time, he grew dissatisfied with a science of the mind that seemed to concern itself almost exclusively with pathology, dysfunction, and mechanical conditioning, while having almost nothing to say about health, creativity, or the upper reaches of human potential. The science of psychology, Maslow wrote, has been far more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It has revealed to us much about man's shortcomings, his illness, his sins, but little about his potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations. It was, in essence, a complaint that psychology had spent decades studying the broken machine while almost entirely ignoring the machine running well. In response, Maslow proposed a different research strategy. Rather than studying troubled patients in a clinical setting, as Freud largely had, or studying rats and pigeons in a laboratory, as Skinner did, Maslow decided to study what he considered exceptionally healthy, high-functioning human beings, people he believed had achieved an unusually full realization of their own potential. His subjects, drawn from both historical biography and personal acquaintance, included figures such as Abraham Lincoln, Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, and a number of Maslow's own colleagues and friends whom he judged to exhibit similar qualities. It was, by modern standards, a methodologically loose approach. Maslow's sample was small, subjectively selected, and impossible to fully replicate in the rigorous way later psychological research would demand. But from this admittedly informal study, Maslow drew observations that would prove enormously influential. However much later researchers would go on to refine, complicate, and in some respects challenge his original framework. Maslow proposed that human motivation could be understood as a hierarchy of needs, often depicted, though this exact visual pyramid was actually a later simplification introduced by others rather than something Maslow himself drew, as a series of ascending levels. At the base sit physiological needs: food, water, warmth, rest, the basic requirements of biological survival. Above that, safety needs: security of body, of employment, of health, of resources, protection against the unpredictable dangers of the world. Above that, love and belonging: friendship, intimacy, family, a sense of connection to others. Above that, esteem: the need to be respected, to achieve, to feel a sense of competence and recognition, both from others and from oneself. And at the summit, a level Maslow considered categorically different from all the others, sat self-actualization, the need to become, in Maslow's words, everything that one is capable of becoming. The realization of one's own unique potential, whatever form that might take for a given individual. Maslow's central claim was that these needs generally operate in a rough sequence of priority, that a person struggling to find their next meal or a safe place to sleep is unlikely to be preoccupied with questions of creative self-realization, not because such higher pursuits do not matter to them, but because the mind, quite sensibly, prioritizes survival before it turns its attention toward growth. Only once the more basic needs are reasonably secured, Maslow argued, does a person's attention and energy become free to pursue the higher, more distinctly human aspirations: belonging, esteem, and ultimately, the open-ended project of becoming fully oneself. This idea, elegant and intuitive as it is, has not gone unchallenged by later research. Cross-cultural studies have found that the strict ordering Maslow proposed does not hold universally. People across different cultures and circumstances do not always pursue needs in the precise sequence he described, and there are countless documented examples of individuals pursuing meaning, connection, or creative expression, even in conditions of significant material deprivation. From prisoners of war composing poetry to impoverished artists producing extraordinary work. Maslow's hierarchy, in other words, should be understood less as an iron law of human psychology and more as a useful, generally reliable pattern, a rough map rather than a fixed territory. But the deeper insight underlying Maslow's work has held up remarkably well, and it remains, in many ways, the essential counterbalance to both Freud and Skinner. Where Freud saw the mind as a battleground between primal desire and internalized restraint, and Skinner saw behavior as a mechanical product of reward and punishment, Maslow insisted that human beings are also, unmistakably, forward-reaching creatures, driven not solely by trauma to escape or reinforcement to chase, but by an authentic, positive pull toward growth, meaning, and the fullest expression of their own particular capacities. Later in his career, Maslow would go so far as to suggest that self-actualization was not even the final peak of human motivation, proposing a further category he called self-transcendence, a state in which a person's deepest fulfillment comes not from realizing their own individual potential, but from connection to something beyond the self entirely. A cause, a community, a spiritual conviction, a devotion to others. It is a fitting note on which to close this chapter, because it returns us, in its own way, to where this documentary began. The philosophers at Delphi urged their visitors to know themselves. Maslow, 23 centuries later, working from an entirely different set of tools and assumptions, arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion: that the deepest work of a human life is not merely survival, but the long, often difficult project of discovering and becoming who one most authentically is. And that, having done so, the very summit of that project may lie in turning outward again, offering that fully realized self in service of something larger than the self alone. We have now met the architects of the hidden mind, Freud's unconscious, Jung's shadow and archetypes, Pavlov and Skinner's conditioned and reinforced behavior, Maslow's hierarchy of longing. Each offered a different lens, and each, we should now recognize, offered only a partial picture. To complete the portrait, we must turn to a different question entirely, not simply what shapes the mind from beneath or from without, but how the conscious, reasoning mind, the part of us that feels most fully in control, so often gets things quietly, predictably, and systematically wrong. In 1969, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a young psychologist named Amos Tversky gave a guest lecture to a graduate seminar taught by a colleague named Daniel Kahneman. The two men had known of each other but had never worked closely together. By the end of that seminar, an argument had broken out, not a hostile one, but the kind of energetic intellectual disagreement that, in the right circumstances, becomes the seed of something larger. Kahneman, intrigued and unconvinced by some of what Tversky had presented, invited him to continue the conversation. That conversation did not really stop for the next 3 decades, and it would go on to fundamentally reshape not only psychology, but economics, medicine, law, and public policy across the world. Kahneman and Tversky began by asking a deceptively simple question. When people make judgments under uncertainty, estimating a probability, predicting an outcome, weighing a risk, do they reason the way classical economic theory assumed they did, as rational calculators weighing costs and benefits with something approaching statistical precision? Or do they rely on something else entirely? The answer, which the two researchers demonstrated across dozens of carefully designed experiments throughout the 1970s, was that human beings, even highly educated and intelligent ones, rely overwhelmingly on mental shortcuts. What Kahneman and Tversky called heuristics, quick, efficient rules of thumb that generally serve us well in everyday life, but that, under certain predictable and identifiable conditions, lead to systematic, repeatable errors in judgment. Not random mistakes, the kind any reasoning system might occasionally make, but biases, consistent, directional distortions that could be anticipated in advance, because they arose not from carelessness, but from the basic architecture of how the mind processes information. This work eventually crystallized, in Kahneman's 2011 book Thinking, Fast and Slow, into one of the most influential frameworks in modern psychology: the idea that the human mind operates through 2 distinct systems of thought. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and largely effortless, the mode of thinking responsible for recognizing a friend's face in a crowd, reacting instinctively to a sudden loud noise, or completing the phrase bread and, without conscious deliberation. System 2, by contrast, is slow, deliberate, effortful, and consciously controlled. The mode of thinking required to solve a complex arithmetic problem, compare 2 insurance policies, or carefully weigh a difficult decision. The trouble Kahneman and Tversky's research revealed is that System 1 is not merely a supporting player, quietly deferring to System 2 whenever a genuinely important decision arises. System 1 is, by a wide margin, the dominant force in most human judgment, running continuously in the background, generating quick impressions, intuitions, and feelings that System 2 then tends to simply accept and rationalize, rather than rigorously scrutinize. System 2, for all its careful, logical capability, is also lazy, cognitively expensive to sustain, and therefore invoked by the mind only reluctantly, often only when System 1's fast, intuitive answer feels obviously insufficient. This division echoes, in strikingly modern scientific language, an idea we encountered all the way back in Chapter 2, Plato's charioteer, struggling to guide 2 very different horses, one obedient to reason, one driven by impulse. It is a reminder that our oldest philosophical metaphors and our newest experimental findings are, in this instance, describing the same underlying reality, simply in different vocabularies, separated by 24 centuries. Kahneman and Tversky's research would eventually earn Kahneman the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002. Awarded, notably, in economics rather than psychology, and awarded to Kahneman alone, since Tversky had died of cancer in 1996, and the prize is not given posthumously, a fact Kahneman has spoken about publicly with evident sorrow, describing the prize as something the two men had, in every meaningful sense, earned together. Their joint work effectively founded an entire field, now known as behavioral economics, built on a single, foundational, almost heretical claim for economics at the time, that human beings are not the purely rational actors classical economic models had long assumed, but predictably irrational creatures, subject to specific, catalogable, and crucially anticipatable errors in judgment. In the next chapter, we will walk through some of the most well-documented of these errors, the specific biases that quietly distort human decision-making every single day, often without our even noticing they are at work. Understanding them will not make you immune to them. Even the researchers who discovered these biases have readily admitted that knowing about a bias does not fully protect you from falling into it. But it will, at the very least, give you something the mind rarely offers on its own. A moment's pause before the fast, automatic system 1 quietly writes the final answer. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a grand hall of mirrors, but every mirror in this hall is subtly warped. Some stretch your reflection taller, some compress it. Some show only the parts of you standing closest to the glass, ignoring everything behind. You would still recognize the reflection as yourself. You might not even notice the distortion at all. This, in essence, is what cognitive biases do to human judgment. They do not replace our perception of reality with something unrecognizable. They subtly warp it in specific, predictable directions, while leaving us with the confident, unshaken feeling that we are seeing things exactly as they are. Consider anchoring, one of the earliest and most robust biases Kahneman and Tversky documented. In one of their classic experiments, participants watched a wheel of fortune, rigged to stop at either the number 10 or the number 65, spin and land on its result. They were then asked an entirely unrelated question: what percentage of countries in the United Nations were African nations? Participants who had seen the wheel land on 65 gave estimates significantly higher, on average, than participants who had seen it land on 10, despite the wheel's number having absolutely nothing to do with the actual answer. Simply being exposed to an arbitrary number had anchored their subsequent estimate, pulling their final judgment toward it, even though, consciously, every participant understood the wheel was random and irrelevant. This is why the first number mentioned in a salary negotiation, the first price listed on a menu, or the original price crossed out beside a discounted one in a shop window carries so much invisible power over our subsequent judgment, regardless of how carefully we believe ourselves to be reasoning. Consider confirmation bias, perhaps the most consequential of all the biases we will discuss in this documentary, given how directly it shapes political division, personal relationships, and even scientific error. Confirmation bias describes the mind's strong, largely automatic tendency to seek out, notice, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while overlooking, dismissing, or explaining away information that contradicts it. It is why two people can review the exact same set of facts about a contested issue, and each walk away feeling their own position has been thoroughly vindicated. The mind, it turns out, does not naturally function as a neutral judge weighing evidence. It functions far more often as a lawyer already committed to a client, the belief it already holds, and searching primarily for arguments to defend that client, rather than searching honestly for the truth. Consider the availability heuristic, our tendency to judge the likelihood or frequency of an event based not on actual statistical probability, but on how easily examples of it come to mind. This is why people often report greater fear of shark attacks or plane crashes than of heart disease or car accidents, despite the latter being, by an enormous margin, statistically far more likely causes of death. Vivid, dramatic, heavily reported events are simply easier for the mind to recall, more available. And the mind, taking that ease of recall as a proxy for actual frequency, systematically overestimates their true probability. Consider loss aversion, one of Kahneman and Tversky's most cited findings, which demonstrates that human beings feel the psychological pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. Losing $100 hurts, on average, about twice as much as finding $100 feels good. This single asymmetry explains an enormous range of otherwise puzzling human behavior. Why investors hold onto losing stocks far longer than logic would suggest, hoping to avoid locking in a loss. Why people remain in unsatisfying jobs, relationships, or routines rather than risk the possibility, however statistically favorable, of a worse outcome. Why a simple change in the framing of a choice, describing a medical treatment as having a 90% survival rate, rather than a mathematically identical 10% mortality rate, measurably changes how people evaluate it, even though the underlying facts have not changed at all. Consider the sunk cost fallacy, our tendency to continue investing time, money, or effort into something simply because we have already invested time, money, or effort into it, rather than evaluating the decision fresh, based only on its future costs and benefits. The person who sits through a film they are not enjoying because they have already paid for the ticket. The company that continues funding a failing project because of how much has already been spent. The person who remains in a relationship well past its natural end because of how many years we've put into this. Each is being governed not by rational forward-looking judgment, but by the ghost of a past investment that, in strict economic terms, can never actually be recovered, regardless of what happens next. There are dozens more, the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which people with the least competence in a given domain often show the greatest, most unwarranted confidence in their own ability, simply because the very skills required to recognize incompetence are often the same skills the incompetent person lacks. The halo effect, in which one positive trait, such as physical attractiveness, causes us to unconsciously assume a person also possesses other, entirely unrelated positive traits, such as intelligence or kindness. The fundamental attribution error, in which we tend to explain other people's failures as reflections of their character, while explaining our own identical failures as unfortunate products of circumstance. What unites all of these biases, and dozens more that researchers have documented since Kahneman and Tversky's foundational work, is not that human reasoning is broken or defective in some simple sense. Quite the opposite. Every one of these mental shortcuts likely evolved for good reason. They allowed our ancestors to make fast, generally serviceable decisions in an environment where hesitation could be fatal, and where perfect information was never available. The hunter who heard a rustle in the grass and immediately assumed danger, rather than pausing to calculate the precise statistical likelihood of a predator being present, was more likely to survive and pass on his genes than the hunter who reasoned with perfect, but slow, rationality. Our biases are not bugs in an otherwise perfect system. They are the fingerprints of an ancient survival machine, still running its original programming inside a modern world. It was never designed for a world of financial markets, mass media, and decisions with consequences unfolding over decades, rather than the immediate physical dangers our minds evolved to navigate. Understanding this does not grant us immunity, but it offers something almost as valuable, which is humility, the recognition that the confident, effortless feeling of knowing something is not, on its own, reliable evidence that we actually do. There is a comforting assumption most people carry, largely without examining it, about the nature of memory. We tend to imagine it as something like a video recording, an accurate, if occasionally incomplete, archive of events as they actually happened, stored somewhere in the brain and retrieved, when needed, in more or less the same form it was originally recorded. This assumption feels intuitively obvious. It is also, according to decades of careful research, substantially false. The psychologist most responsible for dismantling this assumption is Elizabeth Loftus, whose work beginning in the 1970s transformed our understanding of memory from a passive recording device into something far more active, far more creative, and far more fallible, a process of ongoing reconstruction. In one of her most famous studies, conducted with her colleague John Palmer, participants watched footage of a car accident and were then asked how fast the cars were traveling when they hit each other. Other participants, watching the identical footage, were asked the same question, but with a single word changed: how fast the cars were traveling when they smashed into each other. That single word shift measurably changed participants' speed estimates, and more remarkably, changed what they later reported having seen. Participants asked about cars that smashed were significantly more likely to falsely recall broken glass in the footage, even though no broken glass had actually appeared. Loftus went further, demonstrating in subsequent research that it was possible to implant entirely false memories in a person's mind, memories of events that never occurred at all, simply through suggestive questioning and repeated exposure to a false narrative, often planted by a trusted family member as part of the experimental design. Some participants not only came to believe these fabricated events had happened to them, they elaborated on them, adding vivid sensory details, emotional color, and specific dialogue to events that existed nowhere, except in the reconstructive machinery of their own minds. This does not mean memory is useless, or that all of it is unreliable. It means something more specific and, in its own way, more interesting. That every time we recall a memory, we are not opening a sealed file and reading it unchanged. We are, in a very real neurological sense, rebuilding it, drawing on fragments of the original experience, but also on our current beliefs, our current emotional state, information we have absorbed since the event occurred, and the subtle influence of how the memory is being asked for. And because that reconstruction happens every single time a memory is recalled, it means the very act of remembering can slightly alter the memory itself, before it is filed back away, ready to be reconstructed slightly differently the next time. This has a profound implication for something psychologists call narrative identity, the ongoing, largely unconscious story each of us constructs about who we are, drawing from selectively remembered and often subtly reshaped episodes of our own past. We do not experience ourselves as a disconnected sequence of unrelated moments. We experience ourselves as the protagonist of a continuous story, one with a beginning, a developing arc, recurring themes, and crucially, a particular meaning we have assigned to the events within it. Two siblings can grow up in the exact same household, experience largely overlapping events, and emerge with dramatically different personal narratives. One remembering a childhood of resilience and adventure, the other remembering the same years as a story of hardship and neglect, not because either sibling is lying, but because each has, quite genuinely, reconstructed a different story from an overlapping, but not identical set of raw material. This has real, practical weight. The psychologist Dan McAdams, who pioneered much of the research on narrative identity, found that the way people frame the difficult chapters of their own life story carries measurable psychological consequences. People who construct what McAdams calls redemptive narratives, stories in which suffering, however real and however painful, is eventually followed by growth, meaning, or positive transformation, tend to show significantly higher levels of psychological well-being than people whose narratives follow a contamination sequence, in which a once good chapter is remembered as having been permanently ruined by what came after. The underlying facts of a difficult period do not change. What changes is the story built around them, and that story, however unconsciously constructed, appears to shape not just how a person feels about their past, but how they approach their future. None of this is an invitation to fabricate a rosier past than the one that actually occurred, nor is it a license to dismiss genuine trauma as just a story. It is, instead, an invitation to a particular kind of humility and a particular kind of agency held together. Humility because it means our confident sense of what really happened in our own lives and in our arguments with others is far less fixed and far more constructed than it feels from the inside. And agency because if the self is, in part, a story we are continually and unconsciously reconstructing, then some portion of that reconstruction, how we interpret, frame, and make meaning of what has happened to us, remains, at least partially, within our own hands. In August of 1971, in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University, a young professor named Philip Zimbardo converted a section of hallway into a makeshift prison. He recruited 24 male college students, screened in advance for psychological stability and the absence of any criminal background, and by the flip of a coin, randomly assigned each of them to play the role of either prisoner or guard, for what was intended to be a 2-week study of the psychological effects of imprisonment. The study did not last 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days. What Zimbardo observed, and later documented extensively, was a transformation in behavior that shocked even the researchers who had designed the study to look for exactly this kind of effect. The students assigned to play guards, given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and a set of loosely defined authority over the prisoners, began, within a remarkably short period, to behave with escalating cruelty, devising humiliating punishments, enforcing arbitrary rules and subjecting the prisoners to psychological abuse that, by several accounts, went well beyond anything the study's design had anticipated or authorized. The students assigned to play prisoners, meanwhile, began showing genuine signs of acute psychological distress. One participant had to be released from the study after only 36 hours, suffering what appeared to be a severe stress reaction. Uncontrollable crying, disorganized thinking, rage brought on entirely by a role he knew, on some level, to be a simulation. Zimbardo's central and most disturbing conclusion was that the transformation he witnessed was not the product of unusually cruel or unusually fragile individuals. The participants had been carefully screened precisely to rule out that explanation. Rather, Zimbardo argued ordinary, psychologically healthy young men had been placed into a situation, a specific set of roles, environments, and unchecked authority that was, in itself, powerful enough to produce cruelty and breakdown that neither the guards nor the prisoners would have predicted of themselves beforehand. Zimbardo called this the power of the situation to override individual character, and it became one of the most cited and most controversial findings in the history of social psychology. It is important, in the spirit of intellectual honesty this documentary has tried to maintain throughout, to note that the Stanford prison experiment has faced serious methodological criticism in the decades since it was conducted, criticism that has intensified considerably in recent years. Later analysis of original audio recordings and interviews with participants suggested that Zimbardo, who personally played the role of prison superintendent throughout the study, may have actively coached some of the guards toward more aggressive behavior, rather than the cruelty emerging purely and spontaneously from the situation itself, as the original account implied. Some participants have since stated in interviews that they were, to varying degrees, performing what they believed the researchers wanted to see, rather than undergoing a genuine, unprompted psychological transformation. This does not mean the study revealed nothing real, but it does mean it should be presented, honestly, as a deeply flawed and heavily contested piece of research. Rather than the clean, definitive demonstration of situational power it was long treated as in psychology textbooks and popular retellings alike. What makes the Stanford study still worth including in this documentary, despite its serious flaws, is that its central claim, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty under the right situational pressures, did not stand alone. It echoed and was echoed by a separate and more methodologically rigorous body of research conducted just a few years earlier at Yale University by a psychologist whose findings remain, to this day, among the most unsettling and most carefully replicated in the entire field. The year was 1961. In Jerusalem, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Nazi logistics behind the deportation of millions of Jews to concentration camps, was underway, broadcast to a watching world. The political theorist Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, would soon publish her account of it under a phrase that has since entered the common vocabulary of the 20th century: the banality of evil. Her observation that Eichmann, far from presenting as a monstrous, sadistic figure, appeared instead as a strikingly ordinary bureaucrat, a man who seemed to have committed atrocities not out of hatred, but out of a kind of thoughtless, procedural obedience. At Yale University, a young psychologist named Stanley Milgram watched these events unfold and found himself gripped by a question that felt, to him, both scientific and deeply personal. As a Jewish American whose own extended family had been affected by the Holocaust, could ordinary Americans, not Nazi Germany's particular historical population, but ordinary people from an ordinary American city, be induced through simple obedience to authority to inflict serious harm on another human being? Milgram designed an experiment of deceptively simple structure. Recruited participants were told they were taking part in a study of learning and memory. They were assigned, seemingly at random, though in reality the assignment was rigged, to play the role of teacher, while a second participant, who was unknown to the real subject, an actor working for Milgram, was assigned the role of learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room and connected to electrodes. The teacher was seated before a large console fitted with a row of switches, each labeled with an increasing voltage, ranging from a mild 15 volts up to a clearly marked 450 volts. The final switches ominously labeled danger, severe shock, and beyond that simply XXX. The teacher's task was straightforward: read a series of word pairs to the learner and if the learner answered incorrectly, administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each subsequent mistake. In reality, no shocks were ever actually delivered. The learner, following a carefully scripted set of responses, would begin to protest as the voltage climbed. First a grunt of discomfort, then explicit verbal objections, then desperate pleas to be released, references to a heart condition, and eventually, at the higher voltage levels, an ominous, complete silence, suggesting the learner may have been rendered unconscious or worse. Before conducting the experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, colleagues, and students, asking them to predict what percentage of ordinary participants would continue administering shocks all the way to the maximum, clearly dangerous 450-volt level, simply because a calm authority figure in the room, wearing a lab coat, instructed them to continue. The consensus prediction was that only a small fraction of participants, perhaps 1 in 1,000, and likely only those with some pre-existing sadistic or pathological disposition, would go that far. The actual results were dramatically, disturbingly different. In Milgram's original study, 65% of participants, nearly 2 out of every 3 ordinary people recruited from the general public of New Haven, Connecticut, continued administering shocks all the way to the maximum 450-volt level, despite visible signs of their own distress. Sweating, trembling, nervous laughter, verbal protests to the experimenter, and in some cases, visible anguish. Nearly all participants continued at least well past the point where the learner had begun audibly pleading to stop. Milgram's explanation and the broader body of research it launched centered on what he termed the agentic state, a psychological shift in which an individual, once they perceive themselves to be acting under the direction of a legitimate authority, begins to experience themselves less as an autonomous moral agent, personally responsible for their own actions, and more as an instrument, a mere conduit carrying out someone else's will. In this state, Milgram argued, ordinary moral restraint does not so much collapse as it is quietly, almost imperceptibly, relocated. Responsibility for the outcome is psychologically transferred to the authority giving the instructions, freeing the person actually performing the action from the full weight of what they are doing. Milgram's experiment has, like Zimbardo's, faced legitimate ethical criticism in the decades since the psychological distress experienced by participants during the study, some of whom did not learn until well afterward that the shocks had been fake, raised serious questions about informed consent that helped reshape the ethical guidelines governing psychological research to this day. Guidelines that would make an experiment like Milgram's impossible to conduct in its original form now. But unlike Zimbardo's study, Milgram's core findings have been substantially replicated, with appropriate ethical modifications, across numerous countries, cultures, and decades, lending them a degree of scientific durability that Zimbardo's more theatrical and more contested prison study cannot claim. Taken together, what these studies, Milgram's rigorously and Zimbardo's more tentatively, suggest is something genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. That the line between an ordinary, decent person and someone capable of participating in real harm to another human being is, under specific situational and social pressures, considerably thinner and more permeable than most of us would like to believe about ourselves. This is not a claim that human beings are secretly monstrous. It is a more precise and in some ways more useful claim. That context, authority, incremental commitment, and the diffusion of personal responsibility are powerful enough forces to override individual conscience in a meaningful percentage of otherwise ordinary people. Which means that protecting against real-world atrocity depends considerably less on identifying and removing a small number of inherently evil individuals, and considerably more on designing institutions, cultures, and personal habits of mind that make it harder for ordinary obedience to authority to slide, one small incremental step at a time, into complicity with serious harm. Picture a deer alone at the edge of a forest clearing at dusk. A twig snaps somewhere in the undergrowth. In the span of a fraction of a second, long before the deer has consciously identified what made the sound, its body has already begun to change. Its heart rate spikes. Blood diverts away from digestion and toward the large muscles of the legs. Its pupils dilate. Every system not immediately relevant to fighting or fleeing is temporarily suppressed, while every system relevant to rapid escape is placed on urgent alert. All of this happens before the deer has any conscious awareness of what, specifically, it is responding to. It might be a predator. It might be nothing more than a falling branch. But biology, favoring caution over accuracy in matters of survival, would rather the deer flee 100 false alarms than fail to flee the one real threat. Human beings carry, buried deep within an otherwise vastly more complex brain, essentially the same emergency system. At the center of it sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, part of what neuroscientists refer to as the limbic system. A set of ancient brain structures involved in emotion, motivation, and memory that predate, in evolutionary terms, the more recently developed regions of the human brain responsible for language, abstract reasoning, and long-term planning. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, whose research has been especially influential in mapping the neural pathways of fear, demonstrated that sensory information reaching the brain travels along two separate routes. One route, which Ledoux called the low road, carries information directly and rapidly from the thalamus, an early relay station for sensory input, straight to the amygdala, a fast but relatively crude pathway that allows the brain to begin mounting a threat response before it has even finished properly identifying what the threat actually is. The second route, the high road, carries the same sensory information first through the cortex, the brain's more sophisticated processing center, allowing for a slower but far more accurate and nuanced evaluation of the situation. This is why a person can feel their heart lurch, their body flood with adrenaline at the sight of a coiled shape on a hiking trail, only to realize, a half-second later, once the high road has caught up, that the coiled shape is merely a garden hose, not a snake. The fear arrived first, the understanding arrived second, and this ordering, Ledoux's research suggests, is not a flaw in the system. It is, evolutionarily speaking, precisely the point. An ancestor who felt fear first and verified the threat second survived far more often than an ancestor who insisted on careful verification before allowing themselves to feel anything at all. Emotion, in other words, is not the opposite of rational thought, an unfortunate biological interference that a truly logical mind would be better off without. A view that dominated a great deal of both ancient and modern thinking about the mind. It is, instead, an extraordinarily fast and efficient information processing system in its own right, one that evolved specifically to help an organism respond appropriately to its environment faster than slow, deliberate reasoning ever could. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to the brain's emotional centers offered a striking demonstration of just how essential emotion is to good decision-making, rather than merely an obstacle to it. Damasio studied patients whose emotional processing had been impaired by brain injury, while their logical reasoning capacities remained largely intact. These patients could still perform well on abstract reasoning tests, still articulate the pros and cons of a given decision with perfect logical clarity. And yet, in real life, many of them became strikingly incapable of making even simple everyday decisions, unable to choose what to eat, what to wear, or how to plan their schedule, often deliberating for what should have been trivial choices for unreasonably long periods, weighing endless logical permutations without ever arriving at a felt sense of which option actually mattered more. Without the quiet, background guidance of emotion, Damasio's research suggested pure logic alone struggles to know what to value in the first place. The chemistry underlying these emotional states involves a cast of neurotransmitters and hormones now familiar even outside scientific circles. Dopamine, associated less with pleasure itself, as popular understanding often assumes, and more precisely with the anticipation of reward, the motivational pull toward something desired, which is why dopamine tends to spike most sharply not at the moment of receiving a reward, but in the moments of pursuing and anticipating it. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, released by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threat, useful in short bursts for mobilizing energy and focus, but corrosive to the body and the brain when elevated chronically over long periods, contributing to a wide range of physical and psychological harm. Serotonin, involved in the regulation of mood, appetite, and sleep, and the target of many modern antidepressant medications. And oxytocin, sometimes popularly, if imprecisely, called the bonding hormone, released during physical touch, childbirth, breastfeeding, and moments of trust and social connection. None of this chemistry operates in isolation, and none of it operates with the simple one-to-one correspondence. This hormone causes this feeling that popular science writing sometimes implies. The emotional life of a human being is an extraordinarily complex interacting system. shaped simultaneously by ancient evolutionary programming, immediate biochemical state, learned associations from past experience, and the particular meaning a person consciously or unconsciously assigns to what is happening to them. But understanding even the broad outlines of this system offers something practically valuable. It reframes emotion not as something happening to us, an irrational interruption of our true rational self, but as a sophisticated, ancient, and generally quite intelligent information system. One that, like any system built for a different environment than the one it currently operates in, occasionally produces signals that are more intense or less accurate than the present situation actually warrants. If emotion in general is an ancient information system, fear is its oldest and most urgent department, evolution's earliest and most heavily reinforced warning mechanism, present in some recognizable form across a vast range of the animal kingdom, from the reflexive withdrawal of a sea snail's gill to the complex, anticipatory dread a human being can feel weeks before a difficult conversation that has not yet even happened. What makes human fear distinct from the fear of a deer at a forest's edge is precisely the sophistication that Damasio, Ledoux, and the researchers of Part 3 have already shown us. The human cortex, capable of abstract reasoning, memory, and imagination, is also capable of generating fear in response to threats that exist nowhere except in projected, imagined futures. A deer fears the immediate rustle in the grass. A human being can fear a job interview 3 weeks away, a diagnosis not yet received, an argument not yet had, a failure not yet occurred, and which may, in fact, never occur at all. Psychologists call this capacity, when it becomes chronic and disproportionate to actual present danger, anxiety. Essentially, the ancient fear system evolved to respond to immediate physical threats, being triggered instead by abstract, temporally distant, or entirely hypothetical ones, often for hours or days at a stretch, in a way no other animal's nervous system is quite so capable of sustaining. This distinction matters enormously because it means the biological fear response, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscular tension, a narrowed and hypervigilant focus of attention, was designed by evolution for short, intense bursts tied to genuine, immediate physical danger, followed by relatively swift resolution, one way or another. It was not designed to be sustained, quietly in the background, for weeks or months at a time, in response to a worry about a future that has not yet arrived and might never arrive in the feared form at all. And yet this is precisely the pattern that chronic modern anxiety often takes. The body's ancient emergency system, built for the occasional genuine crisis, running instead at a low, near-constant hum in response to the abstract, ongoing uncertainties of modern life. Financial precarity, professional evaluation, social judgment, the ever-present awareness, uniquely available to a species capable of imagining its own future, of illness, aging, and mortality. The psychiatrist Robert Sapolsky, whose long career studying stress physiology in wild baboon populations in Kenya, produced one of the most illuminating comparative studies of stress ever conducted, put this contrast memorably in the title of his best-known book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Sapolsky's observation was that a zebra's stress response, like the deer's, is activated by genuine, immediate physical threats, the approach of a lion, and resolves quickly once the threat has passed, whether through successful escape or, if unlucky, the swift conclusion of the chase. The zebra does not lie awake in the grass rehearsing yesterday's near miss with the lion, nor does it anxiously anticipate next month's potential predator activity. Human beings, uniquely equipped with a cognitive capacity for extended abstract thought, do both of these things constantly. And it is this capacity, this same remarkable gift of imagination and forward planning that has allowed our species to build civilizations, solve complex problems, and prepare thoughtfully for genuine future risks. That also renders us uniquely vulnerable to a stress response, chronically activated by threats that are imagined rather than actually present. This is not a case for eliminating fear altogether, which would be neither possible nor wise. Fear, used well, remains one of the most valuable systems the mind possesses, alerting us to genuine danger and motivating necessary caution and preparation. It is, instead, an invitation toward a distinction the ancient Stoic philosophers understood with remarkable clarity, nearly 2,000 years before modern neuroscience could explain the biological mechanism behind it. A distinction we will return to in far greater depth in Part 6 of this documentary. The difference between a threat that is genuinely present requiring real and immediate response, and a threat that exists only in the mind's own anticipatory projection of a future that has not yet, and may never, come to pass. In the years following the Second World War, a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby, working with children who had been separated from their parents during the war's evacuations and its aftermath, became increasingly convinced that something essential to healthy human development was being overlooked by the prevailing psychological theories of his time. The dominant behaviorist view held that an infant's bond to its mother was fundamentally transactional. The child attached to the parent simply because the parent was the source of food, and love, in this account, was little more than a conditioned response to the reliable delivery of milk. Bowlby doubted this explanation deeply, and the evidence to properly test it against a genuine alternative arrived, somewhat unexpectedly, from a primate researcher in the United States named Harry Harlow, whose experiments, though ethically troubling by any contemporary standard and rightly criticized for the suffering they caused, produced findings that would permanently reshape our understanding of attachment. Harlow separated infant rhesus monkeys from their biological mothers and raised them instead with two artificial surrogate mothers. One constructed of bare wire mesh, fitted with a bottle that dispensed milk, and the other constructed of soft terracloth, providing no food at all, but offering something closer to the comforting texture of a real mother's body. If the behaviorist account of attachment as simple conditioned response to food were correct, the infant monkeys should have overwhelmingly preferred and bonded with the wire mother who actually fed them. They did not. The infant monkeys spent the overwhelming majority of their time clinging to the soft terracloth mother, visiting the wire mother only briefly, out of necessity, to feed, before immediately returning to the comfort of the cloth. When Harlow introduced a frightening stimulus into the enclosure, the infant monkeys ran not to the mother who fed them, but to the mother who offered comfort, using her as what psychologists would later term a secure base from which to cautiously investigate the frightening object, before retreating again to her comforting presence. This finding, brutal as its methodology was, offered powerful evidence for what Bowlby had already begun to argue on the basis of his clinical observations. That attachment is not primarily about the satisfaction of physical need, but about the deep, biologically rooted need for comfort, safety, and consistent emotional responsiveness from a caregiver. Bowlby, working over subsequent decades, and eventually collaborating closely with the developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, developed what has become one of the most extensively researched and clinically influential frameworks in all of psychology, attachment theory. Ainsworth's own contribution came through an ingenious experimental procedure she called the strange situation, in which a young child's reactions were observed across a structured sequence. Playing in a room with their parent present, the parent briefly leaving the room, a stranger entering, and finally the parent's return. Through careful observation of how children responded, particularly at the moment of the parent's return, Ainsworth identified several distinct patterns, or attachment styles, that appeared to form early in a child's life, in direct relationship to how consistently and sensitively their caregiver had responded to their needs. Children with what Ainsworth termed a secure attachment style showed distress when their parent left the room, but were readily comforted upon their return, quickly settling back into confident play. A pattern associated with caregivers who had, over time, responded consistently and sensitively to the child's needs. Children with an anxious ambivalent attachment style showed intense distress at separation, but were difficult to soothe upon reunion, sometimes appearing to seek closeness while simultaneously resisting it with anger. A pattern often associated with caregiving that had been inconsistent, sometimes responsive and sometimes not, in ways the child could not reliably predict. Children with an avoidant attachment style showed little apparent distress at separation, and notably, showed little apparent interest in reunion either, often actively avoiding the parent upon their return, a pattern frequently associated with caregivers who had, whether through their own limitations or circumstances, been consistently unresponsive or rejecting of the child's expressed emotional needs, teaching the child, in effect, that expressing those needs did not yield comfort and was therefore not worth the vulnerability. What has made attachment theory so enduringly influential, well beyond the study of infancy, is the substantial body of subsequent research demonstrating that these early patterns, formed in the first year or two of life, in relationship to a child's very first bonds, tend to persist in modified and adult-appropriate form into the patterns a person later brings to romantic relationships, friendships, and even their relationship to their own work and ambitions. An adult with an anxious attachment style may find themselves prone to a persistent, difficult-to-soothe fear of abandonment in close relationships, requiring frequent reassurance that can, ironically, sometimes strain the very relationships they are anxious about losing. An adult with an avoidant attachment style may find themselves uncomfortable with too much closeness or emotional demand, instinctively creating distance in relationships precisely at the moment's intimacy deepens. It is essential to add, with the same care this documentary has applied throughout, that attachment style, however durable, is not a life sentence. A substantial body of later research has documented what psychologists call earned security, the capacity of adults with insecure early attachment patterns to develop, often through a combination of self-reflective awareness, therapeutic work, and sustained experience with a securely attached partner or relationship. Patterns of relating that look, by every measurable standard, indistinguishable from those of someone who had been securely attached from the very beginning. The nervous system, it turns out, retains a meaningful capacity for revision throughout adult life, a theme we will return to more fully in Part 6, when we examine the modern science of neuroplasticity. What Bowlby, Ainsworth, and Harlow's difficult but revealing research collectively demonstrated is something the poets and philosophers had long intuited, but psychology had, until the mid-20th century, never rigorously confirmed. That connection to another human being is not a luxury layered on top of more basic biological needs, but something closer to a basic biological need in its own right, as fundamental to healthy development, and to a felt sense of safety in the world as food or warmth. Which brings us, naturally, to the question of what happens on the other side of that connection. Not merely how we come to attach to others, but what love itself, in its adult and fully developed form, actually is. The American psychologist Robert Sternberg, working at Yale in the late 1980s, proposed a theory that attempted to answer a question that had, until then, been left largely to poets. What actually constitutes romantic love? And why does it seem to take such different forms across different relationships and different stages of the same relationship? Sternberg's answer, which he called the triangular theory of love, proposed that love could be understood as composed of three distinct components, each capable of varying independently of the other two. Intimacy, the sense of closeness, connection, and mutual understanding between two people. Passion, the physical and emotional arousal, including but not limited to sexual attraction. And commitment, the conscious decision to remain in the relationship and to work toward its continuation over time. Different combinations of these three components, Sternberg argued, produce recognizably different kinds of love. Intimacy alone without passion or commitment looks like friendship. Passion alone produces infatuation, the intense, often disorienting rush of early attraction that, without the slower developing components of intimacy and commitment, tends to be unstable and short-lived. Commitment alone, without intimacy or passion, describes what Sternberg somewhat starkly termed empty love, relationships that persist through obligation or habit, absent the emotional substance that originally, or ideally, sustains them. And the presence of all three components together, in Sternberg's framework, constitutes what he called consummate love, the fullest and most complete form the theory describes, though Sternberg himself was careful to note that even consummate love requires ongoing maintenance, since any of its three components can fade if left unattended. What Sternberg's model captures particularly well, and what makes it useful beyond its role as an academic classification, is the observation that intimacy and commitment typically develop far more gradually than passion, which tends to peak relatively early in a relationship, and then, for biologically well-understood reasons, gradually settle to a lower, steadier baseline. This is not, contrary to a popular and rather cynical assumption, evidence that love itself is dying as the initial intensity of infatuation fades. It is, more accurately, evidence that one particular component of love, the neurochemically driven passion associated primarily with novelty and early-stage attraction, is simply giving way, in a well-functioning relationship, to the slower, deeper development of the other two components, intimacy and commitment, which research consistently associates with longer-term relational satisfaction than passion alone ever could sustain on its own. The neurochemistry underlying this progression, has been studied extensively by researchers such as the anthropologist Helen Fisher, whose work using brain imaging on people newly and intensely in love found patterns of neural activation, strikingly similar to those observed in the brains of individuals with substance addiction. Heavy activation of the brain's dopamine-driven reward circuitry, the same basic system responsible for the pursuit of any powerfully desired reward. This helps explain why early romantic love can feel, quite literally, intoxicating, and why its early loss through rejection or breakup can produce psychological and even physiological symptoms that closely resemble withdrawal. Oxytocin, the hormone we encountered briefly in Chapter 13, plays a particularly important role in the deeper, longer-lasting bonding that tends to characterize more mature relationships. Released during physical touch, sexual intimacy, and childbirth, oxytocin appears to promote feelings of trust, attachment, and closeness, functioning as something like the neurochemical signature of Sternberg's intimacy component. The slower, steadier glue that research suggests becomes increasingly central to relational satisfaction as the more volatile, dopamine-driven passion of early attraction naturally settles over time. It is worth pausing here to notice how directly this research connects back to the attachment theory explored in the previous chapter. The same fundamental need for safety, comfort, and consistent responsiveness that Bowlby and Ainsworth documented in infants reaching for a caregiver reappears, in adult form, in the way partners reach for each other during moments of stress, uncertainty, or vulnerability. The psychologist and couples therapist Sue Johnson, whose approach to relationship therapy draws directly and explicitly on attachment theory, has argued persuasively that many of the recurring conflicts couples experience are not, at their core, disagreements about the surface-level issue being argued, a disagreement about household chores or finances or how to spend a weekend, but are instead expressions of a deeper, often unspoken attachment question. Are you there for me? Can I count on you? Do I matter to you? When a couple can learn to recognize this underlying attachment question beneath their surface conflicts, Johnson's research and clinical work suggests, they often become far more capable of resolving not just the specific disagreement in front of them, but the recurring emotional pattern generating disagreements like it in the first place. Love, in other words, examined through the lens of psychology rather than only through the lens of poetry, turns out to be neither less remarkable nor less real for being explicable. It is, instead, revealed as something even more intricate than the simple, singular feeling our language often reduces it to. A layered interplay of ancient attachment programming, evolved neurochemical reward systems, and the ongoing, conscious human choice to remain committed to another person's flourishing, even and especially after the initial intoxication of passion has settled into something quieter, and, if well tended, considerably more durable. Human beings did not evolve as solitary creatures navigating the world alone. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, survival depended almost entirely on group membership, access to shared food, collective defense against predators and rival groups, and the accumulated knowledge passed down through cooperating members of a tribe. This long evolutionary history has left an indelible mark on the modern human mind, a set of deeply wired social instincts that continue to operate powerfully, and often quite invisibly, in a world that looks nothing like the small hunter-gatherer bands in which those instincts first took shape. In 1951, the psychologist Solomon Asch at Swarthmore College designed an experiment of striking simplicity to test the power of one of these instincts: conformity to the group. Participants were shown a line of a certain length and asked, in a group setting, to identify which of three comparison lines matched it in length. A task so simple, with an answer so visually obvious, that when Asch had participants complete it alone, they made almost no errors at all. But in Asch's actual experimental condition, each real participant was seated among a group of actors, secretly instructed in advance to unanimously give an obviously incorrect answer on certain trials. Faced with a group of several other people, confidently stating an answer that directly contradicted the clear evidence of their own eyes, roughly 75% of Asch's genuine participants conformed to the incorrect group answer on at least one trial, with many later reporting, in post-experiment interviews, real internal conflict. Some genuinely began to doubt their own perception, while others reported knowing the group was wrong but conforming anyway, simply to avoid the social discomfort of standing alone in visible disagreement. Ash's experiment revealed something important about the two distinct forces that can drive human conformity. What psychologists now call informational social influence occurs when we genuinely believe the group possesses more accurate information than we do, and adjust our own judgment accordingly in a sincere attempt to be correct. What psychologists call normative social influence, which appeared to explain a considerable portion of Ash's results, occurs when we conform not because we believe the group is right, but simply to avoid the social discomfort, disapproval, or exclusion that might follow from visible disagreement. A powerful force, given how directly, across our evolutionary history, expulsion from the group could mean the practical difference between survival and death. This same underlying tribal instinct shapes what social psychologists call in-group bias. Our tendency to favor, trust, and extend generosity toward members of groups we identify with, while viewing members of other groups with greater suspicion, less generosity, and a readiness to attribute their failings to fixed character flaws rather than circumstance, a pattern that closely echoes the fundamental attribution error discussed in Chapter 9. What is particularly striking about this bias, as demonstrated in a landmark series of experiments conducted by the social psychologist Henry Tadgeful in the early 1970s, is how remarkably little is actually required to trigger it. Tadgeful divided participants into groups based on entirely trivial, arbitrary criteria. In one version of the experiment, participants were told they preferred one abstract painter's work over another's, based on a nearly meaningless preliminary task, and were then divided into groups on that basis alone. Even under these minimal, essentially meaningless conditions, participants reliably began favoring members of their own assigned group over the other, allocating more resources to their own group's members even when doing so cost them nothing to change and provided them no direct personal benefit. Tadgeful's findings, which came to be known as minimal group studies, carry sobering implications. If in-group favoritism can be triggered this easily on the basis of criteria this arbitrary, it helps explain how much more powerfully and how much more dangerously the same underlying psychological mechanism can be activated and exploited around categories that are far from trivial. Nationality, religion, ethnicity, political affiliation, and class. The tribal instinct that once helped small bands of early humans cooperate effectively for mutual survival is the very same instinct, largely unchanged in its basic wiring, that continues to fuel modern prejudice, political polarization, and intergroup conflict, not because human beings today are more tribal by nature than their ancestors were, but because the same ancient wiring evolved for small, face-to-face bands of perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people, is now applied, often unconsciously, to the vastly larger, more abstract and more consequential groupings of the modern world. Understanding this does not, on its own, dissolve prejudice or tribal division. Tadgeful's own research made clear how automatically and how easily these instincts activate, even without any real basis for hostility between groups. But it does offer something genuinely useful: the recognition that group loyalty and out-group suspicion are not necessarily accurate signals about which people actually deserve our trust or distrust. They are more often the ancient reflexes of a mind built for a much smaller and more immediate social world, activating in response to modern categories: a political party, a national identity, a sports rivalry, that this ancient wiring was never actually designed to evaluate. In 1959, the Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman published a book that would fundamentally reshape how psychologists and sociologists alike understood the everyday performance of the self. Its title, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, announced its central metaphor plainly. Goffman proposed that human social life could be productively understood through the lens of theater, with each of us continuously performing a role, adjusted carefully according to our audience and our setting, in a way that was neither dishonest nor cynical, but simply the basic, necessary grammar of social existence. Goffman drew a distinction between what he called the front stage, the more formal, carefully managed presentation of self we offer in public or professional settings, where we are conscious of being observed and adjust our behavior, tone, and even our expressed opinions accordingly, and the backstage, the more relaxed, unguarded version of ourselves we allow to emerge only in the presence of those we trust enough to let our guard down around, when we believe, correctly or not, that we are free from the evaluative gaze of a wider audience. A restaurant server, Goffman observed in one of his most vivid examples, might present a warm, attentive, unfailingly pleasant demeanor while serving at table, a front stage performance, only to let that carefully maintained composure visibly drop the moment they push through the kitchen door into the backstage area, where the audience of paying customers can no longer see or evaluate them. Goffman's crucial and somewhat provocative insight was that this kind of performance is not a form of inauthenticity or deception in any morally troubling sense. It is, instead, simply how social life functions for a species whose survival and flourishing depend heavily on the impressions we make on others, and on our ability to coordinate smoothly with the shifting expectations of different social contexts. A job interview, a first date, a family dinner, a funeral, a celebration among close friends, each of which calls, quite legitimately, for a somewhat different presentation of the same underlying self. The person who behaved with total, unfiltered consistency across every one of these radically different contexts would not be more authentic in any meaningful sense. They would more likely be experienced by others as socially oblivious, or in some contexts, as genuinely harmful to those around them. This framework helps illuminate a tension that many people experience, often with some private discomfort, in modern life. The nagging feeling that there is a gap between the self we present to the world and some more true self we hold in reserve, known perhaps only to ourselves, or perhaps not even fully known to ourselves at all. Goffman's work suggests this feeling, while genuinely uncomfortable, may rest on a somewhat mistaken premise: the assumption that there exists a single, fixed, essential self, waiting somewhere beneath all the various performances, which the performances then either faithfully express or dishonestly conceal. A more psychologically accurate picture, drawing on Goffman alongside the narrative identity research discussed in Chapter 10, might suggest instead that the self is not a fixed essence hiding behind a mask, but something closer to the accumulated, evolving pattern across all of our various performances and stories, front stage and backstage alike, genuinely responsive to context, and yet, across that responsiveness, still recognizably continuous, still recognizably us, where this tension becomes genuinely worth examining and potentially concerning is not in the ordinary, healthy variation of self-presentation across different social contexts, but in the specific phenomenon of chronic, effortful impression management, a state in which a person feels they must constantly, exhaustingly maintain a front-stage performance, with few or no relationships in which a genuine backstage self is permitted to emerge at all. Research on emotional labor, a term coined by the sociologist Arlie Hochschild to describe the effortful management of one's outward emotional expression as a requirement of a job. The customer service representative required to sound cheerful regardless of their actual mood. The flight attendant required to project calm reassurance during turbulence has found that this kind of sustained, effortful performance, particularly when it requires actively suppressing one's genuine felt emotion rather than simply managing its outward expression, carries measurable psychological costs over time, including elevated stress and increased risk of burnout. The capacity to occasionally step backstage into at least some relationships or contexts where a fuller, less curated version of the self is welcome appears to matter considerably for sustained psychological well-being, a finding that offers a useful, practical lesson beneath Goffman's elegant theatrical metaphor. The performance of self is not, in itself, a problem. The absence of any backstage at all, however, appears to be one. There is a particular kind of unhappiness that has puzzled economists and psychologists alike for decades, precisely because it seems to defy simple logic. The observation, confirmed repeatedly across large-scale survey research, that absolute increases in income and material comfort, once a person's basic needs are reasonably well met, produce surprisingly modest and often short-lived increases in reported life satisfaction. This finding, first prominently documented by the economist Richard Easterlin in a 1974 paper, and subsequently known as the Easterlin paradox, found that within a given country, wealthier individuals do tend to report somewhat higher life satisfaction than poorer individuals at any given moment in time. But as entire societies grow wealthier over time, the average reported happiness of the population as a whole tends to remain remarkably flat, rather than rising in step with rising material prosperity. The explanation that has gained the most substantial research support centers on the deeply social, comparative nature of human well-being. The discovery that a great deal of what we experience as satisfaction or dissatisfaction with our own circumstances is calculated not in absolute terms, but relative to some reference point, most commonly the circumstances of the people immediately around us. A study conducted by the economists Sarah Salnick and David Hemingway asked participants a deliberately provocative hypothetical question. Would you prefer to earn $50,000 a year in a world where everyone else earns $25,000? Or would you prefer to earn $100,000 a year in a world where everyone else earns $200,000? In strict absolute terms, the second option is clearly, and by a wide margin, the materially superior choice, twice the purchasing power of the first. And yet a substantial proportion of participants chose the first option, preferring a lower absolute income that nonetheless positioned them favorably relative to those around them, over a considerably higher absolute income that left them, by comparison, relatively disadvantaged. This tendency reflects what psychologists call social comparison theory, first proposed by Leon Festinger in 1954, which holds that human beings, particularly in circumstances where objective, external standards for evaluating their own abilities, achievements, or well-being are unavailable or ambiguous, instinctively turn to comparison with others as their primary evaluative benchmark. This comparison instinct likely served a genuinely useful evolutionary function within the small, face-to-face tribal groups our ancestors actually lived in. Accurately gauging one's own status, resources, and standing relative to a few dozen or few hundred immediately visible others was directly useful information, relevant to real decisions about mating opportunities, alliance formation, and resource access. The trouble, in the modern context, is one we have now encountered several times across this documentary in different forms. An ancient psychological mechanism, well-suited to the small-scale environment in which it evolved, operating within a radically different modern environment it was never designed to handle, where our ancestors compared themselves to the few dozen or few hundred people within their direct social world. Modern human beings, particularly through social media and constant digital connectivity, are now exposed to a nearly unlimited, carefully curated stream of comparison targets. The professional triumphs, physical appearances, and highlight real-life circumstances of thousands of other people, often selectively presented in their most flattering and successful form. Research on social media use has found a consistent association between heavier engagement with these platforms, particularly image-focused ones, and increased social comparison, along with corresponding decreases in life satisfaction and self-esteem. Not necessarily because social media use is inherently harmful in every context, but because it dramatically, and often invisibly, expands the pool of comparison targets against which the ancient, tribal-scale comparison instinct continues to measure our own worth. Envy, the emotional signature of unfavorable social comparison, has often been treated, across both religious and secular moral traditions, as one of the more shameful human emotions, one of the 7 deadly sins in Christian tradition, and widely regarded, even in secular contexts, as an emotion to be privately felt but rarely acknowledged. But psychological research suggests envy, like fear, anger, and the other emotions examined in Part 4 of this documentary, may be better understood not simply as a moral failing to be suppressed, but as a piece of information, however uncomfortable, about what a person genuinely values, and where they perceive themselves to be falling short relative to that value. The philosopher and psychologist William James, writing as early as 1890, offered a formula for self-esteem that remains strikingly relevant to this discussion. Self-esteem, James proposed, could be understood as a ratio between one's actual achievements or successes and one's own expectations or aspirations. Critically, this ratio, James observed, can be improved in 2 entirely different ways: by increasing the numerator, through greater actual achievement, or by adjusting the denominator, through a more deliberate and honest reevaluation of which expectations and comparisons genuinely deserve to govern one's sense of self-worth in the first place. It is a formula that anticipates, with remarkable precision, an idea the ancient Stoic philosophers had already developed many centuries earlier. A body of thought we will now, at last, turn to directly, as this documentary moves from diagnosis toward practice. In the 2nd century of the Roman Empire, on the northern frontier along the Danube, a Roman emperor spent the long, cold nights of a military campaign writing privately in a notebook that he never intended for publication. never intended for any audience beyond himself. He was not writing history or philosophy for public instruction or a record of his political achievements, considerable as they were. He was writing to himself, reminders, arguments, private exhortations toward the kind of person and the kind of ruler he wished to remain, despite the immense pressures of holding absolute power over the largest empire the Western world had yet known. That emperor was Marcus Aurelius, and the notebook he left behind, which later editors would title Meditations, has survived nearly 2,000 years to become one of the most widely read works of practical philosophy in the world. What is striking about Meditations, read alongside everything we have covered across the previous 19 chapters of this documentary, is how precisely Marcus Aurelius's private philosophical practice anticipates specific findings that would not be experimentally confirmed for another 18 centuries. "Today I escaped from anxiety," he wrote in one representative passage. Or no, I discarded it because it was within me and my own perceptions, not outside. This is not merely elegant, comforting rhetoric. It is articulated with remarkable psychological precision, essentially the same insight later developed by the cognitive researchers we will meet shortly in this chapter. That emotional distress often arises not directly from external events themselves, but from the interpretations, judgments, and appraisals the mind layers on top of those events. An insight that connects directly back to Chapter 14's discussion of anxiety as a fear response frequently triggered by imagined, rather than immediately present threats. Marcus Aurelius belonged to the Stoic school of philosophy, founded in Athens around 300 BCE by a merchant named Zeno of Citium, who, according to tradition, turned to philosophy after surviving a shipwreck that destroyed his cargo and his fortune. A fitting origin story for a philosophical tradition, centrally concerned with how a person maintains equanimity in the face of circumstances entirely outside their control. Zeno taught in a public colonnade in Athens known as the Stoa Poikal, the painted porch, from which the school eventually took its name. Stoicism developed over subsequent centuries through thinkers including Chrysippus, who systematized much of its logical and physical theory, and later, in the Roman world, through three figures whose surviving writings remain the most complete and most influential Stoic texts we have. Seneca, a statesman, playwright, and advisor to the Emperor Nero, whose letters and essays on anger, grief, and the brevity of life remain remarkably readable and relevant today. Epictetus, born into slavery in Asia Minor before eventually gaining his freedom and establishing his own school of philosophy, whose recorded teachings, compiled by a student into a work called the Discourses and later summarized in the compact Enchiridion, or Handbook, offer perhaps the clearest and most practically actionable articulation of Stoic method. And Marcus Aurelius himself, who came to Stoic philosophy not as a professional teacher, but as a working practitioner, applying its principles amid the genuine, high-stakes pressures of running an empire. The central Stoic insight, articulated perhaps most clearly by Epictetus at the very opening of his Enchiridion, is a distinction that Stoic philosophy considered the essential starting point for a well-ordered life. Some things, Epictetus wrote, are within our control, and some things are not. Within our control lie our own judgments, our own intentions, our own desires and aversions, in short, everything that is, in the most fundamental sense, genuinely our own doing. Outside our control lie our body, our reputation, our possessions, and more broadly, virtually everything that happens to us from the external world. The actions of other people, the outcomes of our efforts, the unpredictable turns of fortune, illness, and eventually death itself. The entirety of Stoic practice, in its most distilled and practical form, amounts to the disciplined, repeated effort of correctly sorting one's daily concerns into these two categories, and then directing one's full attention, effort, and emotional investment only toward the first category, that which is genuinely within one's control, while cultivating a settled, undisturbed acceptance toward the second. This is not contrary to a common modern misreading of the word Stoic, a philosophy of emotional suppression or cold detachment from life. The Stoics did not counsel indifference to outcomes, nor did they suggest a person should feel nothing in the face of genuine loss, injustice, or hardship. What they counseled, with considerable psychological sophistication, was a careful discipline concerning where a person locates the source of their peace of mind, not in outcomes that remain, ultimately, beyond any individual's full control, however diligently pursued, but in the quality of one's own effort, judgment, and character. which remain, in the Stoic view, genuinely within reach regardless of external circumstance. It is worth pausing to notice how directly this ancient framework anticipates, and in some respects surpasses in clarity, the cognitive behavioral revolution that would transform clinical psychology in the 20th century. In the 1950s, the American psychologist Albert Ellis developed what he called rational emotive behavior therapy, built on a foundational premise Ellis explicitly credited, in his own writing, to the ancient Stoics, and in particular to a specific line from Epictetus, that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the views they take of those events. Ellis proposed what he termed the ABC model of emotional response. An activating event occurs, followed by a belief the individual holds about that event, which in turn produces the emotional and behavioral consequence. Crucially, Ellis argued, therapeutic intervention should focus not primarily on the activating event itself, which frequently cannot be changed, but on the often distorted, exaggerated, or unexamined beliefs mediating between the event and the resulting emotional suffering. This foundational insight was subsequently developed further by the psychiatrist Aaron Beck, working independently and around the same period into what became cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, today among the most extensively researched and empirically validated forms of psychotherapy available, with a substantial evidence base supporting its effectiveness across a wide range of conditions, including depression and anxiety disorders. Beck's foundational clinical observation, drawn from careful attention to his patients' reported inner experience, was that psychological distress was frequently maintained by automatic, habitual, and often distorted patterns of thought, what Beck termed cognitive distortions, including patterns such as catastrophizing, in which a person automatically assumes the worst possible outcome, overgeneralization, in which a single negative event is treated as an unchangeable, permanent pattern, and black and white thinking, in which situations are evaluated only in absolute, all-or-nothing terms, without recognition of the considerable middle ground that most real situations actually occupy. The core therapeutic task in Beck's framework involves helping a person learn to identify these distorted automatic thoughts as they arise, and to consciously, deliberately evaluate them against the actual available evidence. A discipline of mind that would have been entirely recognizable, in its essential structure, to Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his tent on the Danube frontier 18 centuries earlier. What unites the ancient Stoics and their modern cognitive behavioral descendants is a shared, foundational insight about the architecture of human suffering, that a meaningful portion of our distress arises not directly from what happens to us, but from the layer of interpretation, judgment, and expectation the mind reflexively adds on top of what happens to us, and that this interpretive layer, unlike the external world itself, remains, with sustained and deliberate practice, genuinely within our own capacity to examine, question, and gradually reshape. For much of the 20th century, neuroscience operated under an assumption that, while never quite stated as bluntly as this, shaped a great deal of clinical and popular thinking about the brain, that the adult brain, once fully developed, was essentially fixed, its neural architecture set in place, its capacity for structural change effectively ending sometime in early adulthood. Under this assumption, a person's brain in middle age was thought to be, for all practical therapeutic purposes, the same brain they would carry, largely unchanged, into old age, with any decline being a matter of gradual deterioration rather than genuine ongoing change. This assumption has been thoroughly overturned by several decades of research into what neuroscientists now call neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity, sustained to a meaningful degree throughout the entire human lifespan, to form new neural connections, strengthen or weaken existing ones based on use, and in certain brain regions, even generate entirely new neurons, a process called neurogenesis, once believed to be impossible in the adult human brain, but now well documented, at least within specific regions such as the hippocampus, a structure closely involved in memory formation. Some of the most striking early evidence for adult neuroplasticity came from research on London taxi drivers, conducted by the neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire and her colleagues. London's famously complex street layout requires prospective taxi drivers to pass an extraordinarily demanding examination, known as the knowledge, requiring the memorization of roughly 25,000 individual streets and thousands of points of interest across the city. a process that typically takes several years of dedicated study to complete. Maguire's research found that experienced London taxi drivers showed measurably larger gray matter volume in the posterior hippocampus, the brain region most associated with spatial memory, compared to non-taxi driving control subjects. And, in a subsequent longitudinal study following trainee drivers over the actual multi-year course of their study for the knowledge, Maguire's team documented this hippocampal growth occurring in real time, directly correlated with the extensive spatial memorization the training demanded. The brains of these drivers, in other words, had physically restructured themselves, in adulthood, in direct response to a sustained and demanding cognitive practice. This capacity for change operates in a more general form, according to a principle neuroscientists often summarize, somewhat informally, as neurons that fire together, wire together. A phrase capturing the underlying mechanism first proposed by the psychologist Donald Hebb in 1949, now generally referred to as Hebbian learning. When two neurons are repeatedly activated together, the synaptic connection between them tends to strengthen, making it progressively easier for the activation of one to trigger the activation of the other in the future. This is, at the most basic biological level, the mechanism underlying essentially all learning and habit formation. Repeated thought patterns, repeated emotional responses, and repeated behaviors quite literally strengthen the specific neural pathways associated with them, making those particular patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting progressively more automatic and more readily triggered over time, simply through the accumulated weight of repetition. This finding carries a double-edged practical significance, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging both edges plainly. On one hand, it offers a neurological explanation for how genuinely harmful patterns, chronic anxious thought spirals, self-critical inner narration, addictive behavioral loops of the kind Skinner's variable reinforcement research helps explain, become progressively more deeply entrenched and more automatically triggered the longer they are repeated, since each repetition further strengthens the underlying neural pathway. On the other hand, it offers genuine, evidence-based grounds for hope regarding the deliberate cultivation of healthier alternative patterns, because the same basic mechanism of repetition-driven strengthening applies equally to newly cultivated patterns of thought and behavior. Sustained, deliberate practice of a different way of thinking, responding, or acting can, over time, and with real effort, build new neural pathways robust enough to become genuine competitors to old, more entrenched ones, not through some special metaphysical power of positive thinking, but through the same ordinary, well-documented biological mechanism of use-dependent neural strengthening that built the old pattern in the first place. This research offers an important, evidence-grounded correction to two opposite and equally mistaken popular narratives about personal change. The first mistaken narrative holds that a person's patterns, once established through early attachment experience, through years of habitual response, through an ingrained cognitive style, are essentially fixed and unchangeable, a narrative that neuroplasticity research directly contradicts. The second mistaken narrative, popular in certain strands of self-help culture, holds that change can be accomplished quickly, through a single decisive insight or a brief burst of motivated effort. A narrative the same research equally contradicts, since the actual mechanism of neural rewiring, as Maguire's taxi driver studies illustrate, requires sustained, repeated practice over a meaningful period of time, not a single moment of realization, however genuine or well-intentioned that realization might be. The habits of a lifetime were not built in a day, and the biological mechanism by which they can be meaningfully revised does not, and cannot, operate on the timescale of a day either. What it does offer, with real scientific grounding, is something considerably more valuable than a quick fix. The confirmed, evidence-based knowledge that sustained, deliberate practice genuinely does reshape the physical structure of the brain, generating our thoughts, our emotional responses, and our behavior, which means the disciplined attention the Stoics recommended, and the cognitive restructuring modern therapy practices, is not merely a comforting philosophical exercise, but a form of genuine, physical, neurological labor with measurable results for those willing to sustain it. We began this documentary at the top of a mountain in ancient Greece, standing before a temple where pilgrims once climbed to ask questions of an oracle they believed could see into a future none of them could access on their own. Above the entrance to that temple, two words were carved into stone, not as a prediction of what was to come, but as an instruction for how to properly approach the uncertainty of what was to come. Know thyself. Across the last 3 hours, we have walked through roughly 2.5 millennia of humanity's most serious, most careful attempts to answer that instruction. First through philosophy alone, in the reasoned dialogues of Plato and the careful observations of Aristotle. Then through the birth of psychology as an experimental science, in Wilhelm once small laboratory in Leipzig. Then through the competing, complementary, and often contradictory maps of the mind offered by Freud's unconscious, Jung's archetypes, Pavlov and Skinner's conditioned behavior, and Maslow's hierarchy of human longing. Then through the sobering, carefully documented catalog of the mind's own systematic distortions, its biases, its reconstructed memories, its startling capacity, under specific situational pressures for both conformity and cruelty. Then through the ancient chemical architecture of fear, attachment, and love. Then through the deeply social, deeply comparative creature we turn out, on close examination, to actually be. And finally, back to where we began, in the practical wisdom of the Stoics, now confirmed and extended by modern neuroscience's discovery that the mind, far from being a fixed and finished thing, remains genuinely capable of change throughout an entire human lifetime. If there is a single thread running through all 22 chapters of this documentary, connecting a Roman emperor writing by lamplight on the Danube frontier to a neuroscientist scanning the brains of London taxi drivers, it may be this: that the human mind was not built, by the slow, indifferent process of evolution, to hand us either happiness or truth without effort. It was built, first and foremost, for survival, for the rapid, largely automatic assessment of threat and opportunity in an ancient environment considerably more physically dangerous, and considerably smaller in its social scope than the one most of us now inhabit. The biases that distort our judgment, the fear that outruns present danger, the tribal instinct that divides us along lines increasingly arbitrary in a globally connected world, the comparison instinct that measures our worth against an ever-expanding pool of others. None of these are evidence that something has gone wrong with the human mind. They are evidence of a mind doing exactly what it evolved to do, in a world it did not evolve for. And yet within that same ancient, imperfect architecture, evolution also left us something remarkable: the capacity for reflection itself. The very fact that a human being can examine their own fear and recognize it as disproportionate to present danger, can notice their own bias and correct, at least partially, for its distortion, can observe the story they have constructed about their own past and consciously choose which meaning to carry forward from it, can feel the pull of tribal loyalty and choose, deliberately, to extend consideration beyond its boundaries, can sit with the ancient Stoics, and Ellis and Beck, and consciously separate what lies within their control from what does not. This capacity for self-aware, deliberate revision is not a small thing. It may in fact be the most distinctly human capacity we possess. The ability of a mind, however shaped by ancient pressures and inherited patterns, to turn its attention upon itself, and through sustained and honest attention to genuinely change. This is, in the end, what the philosophers at Delphi seem to have understood, long before any of the science that has occupied the last 3 hours existed to confirm it. Self-knowledge was never presented on that temple's stone entrance as an end in itself, a piece of information to be acquired and then simply possessed, like a fact memorized and set aside. It was presented as a discipline, a practice, a lifelong orientation of attention toward one's own inner workings, undertaken not out of idle curiosity, but because a mind that understands its own tendencies, its own inherited patterns, its own capacity for both distortion and growth, is a mind considerably better equipped to meet whatever the world brings to it, with clearer judgment, with steadier emotion, and with the settled, hard-won peace that comes not from controlling everything that happens to us, which was never within our power to begin with, but from understanding, ever more clearly, the one thing that always was.